Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The Philosophy of TikTok, Baudrillard and Bophouse. I think like a girl takes off her dress. At the extreme, thought is impudence, obscenity even. Jean Baudrillard. Hi everybody, and just to allay any fears, I will not be disrobing during this talk. I quoted Jean Baudrillard right from the beginning because this quote is referred to later on by the philosopher Jean Baudrillard, who I'm going to focus quite a bit this talk on. And talk about, stereotypical French philosopher, but he can't even talk about thinking without talking about women undressing. But this notion of this quite erotic, evocative idea of I think like a girl takes off her dress. What I'm going to suggest is that even this notion of eroticism and even this notion of trying to make a provocative point that thought can be verging on the obscene, one of the main things of this talk is that we've lost that frame of reference that Bataille is referencing here. He was writing in the mid-1900s from memory. I can't remember the specific dates. So he wrote one particularly. He was a philosopher, cultural theorist, and he also wrote quite an erotic, weird book called The Story of the Eye, which I might get on to reference later on. But in less than 100 years, he is talking in a language that's no longer almost the frame of reference, the relevance of what he's saying is almost gone. And what I wanted to explore the idea that our notion of obscenity has qualitatively and profoundly changed, and the implications of that. So without more ado, this is the Bophouse reference from the title, and probably embarrass myself, but I think Bop refers to baddie on point, don't you know? And for those who aren't familiar with the idea, I've only come across it, and not other than for pure research purposes, I hasten to add. But from what I've found out, it's basically an iteration of reality television. So it's a house where these girls live. They're OnlyFans models and mostly porn stars, basically. Not all, but I think most of them. And they promote each other's platforms. So it's like this weird development of reality television. And it comes in a climate at the moment. So I'll show you now a picture of this is Bonnie Blue, who's in it. It's something about the English. There's something in the water at the moment. We're not satisfied with pots of tea and cucumber sandwiches. But this is Bonnie Blue, and there's another porn star called Lily Phillips, and they've both engaged in these sex marathons to try and outdo each other and get a load of promotion. And as usual, all about the money, I suppose. And this is the climate where this hypersexualized, hyper-commercialized attitude to sex has gone beyond all previous bounds, arguably. And this is, I shouldn't laugh, and it's to a large extent it's not funny, but this was the quote from the famous academic source Elle magazine that she did an interview in January 2025. So she told her, this is from the article, she told her ex-followers in one video shot after the 1,057th man had finished last Saturday, "I don't need a wheelchair. I am, fine." And I understand it's not the most significant issue in this quote, but the inclusion of the word "like," I happen, pardon the pun, like it because it just reminds me of all the students I used to teach who couldn't string a sentence together without using like, every third like, word like. And like I say, not the most important issue, but this was her own, her gauging of the success of the event seems to be calibrated along the lines of her still being able to walk unaided, which is one perspective at least. And this is another anonymous source describing the situation. She's been rogered more times than a copper's radio. And for non-American or non-British people, because I think they're both familiar with the notion of a cop or copper, but for non-Brits or Americans, copper meaning police, man or woman. So now we've got that out of the way, we can get more philosophical and academically stringent. But this is a guy called Jean Baudrillard, and he died in 2007, and I'm trying to remember his date of birth. I think it was probably 1929. I'm pretty sure that was right. And I think he's a massively misunderstood philosopher, because he had a certain Gallic sense of humour that I think, ironically, a lot of Anglophone critics and interpreters of his work just completely missed. So he was dismissed by a lot of people as a postmodern relativist. He was condoning modernity or contemporary society and the way it's gone, completely hyper-real. And I'd argue just even a cursory reading of his work suggests the opposite. I honestly think he was much more like an Old Testament prophet, warning of the dangers of the state we've got ourselves in. But I'll give you examples of his concept of the idea of the obscene, and how, as I showed with the Bataille quote, arguably we've lost any concept of the obscene, but to the extent that it can still be discussed in with some type of conceptual clarity, I think Baudrillard offers a really interesting perspective. And just to make the quite obvious point that obscenity has been with us since the year dot, here's an image that will help us get to the bottom of things. Now, I'm not sure which villa this came from, but this is from a Roman villa. And it's of the type of cultural climate that also produced this guy, Hostius Quadra. And plot spoiler, but he lived in the time of Emperor Augustus. And at that time, I've mentioned him briefly in a previous video, but he was murdered by his own slaves, so that's the plot spoiler. And in that time, because the Romans were vastly outnumbered by their slaves, they lived in perpetual fear of the type of slave uprising that happened with Spartacus. So for a master to be killed as he was by his own slaves, routinely all the slaves would have been crucified or killed in a similarly gruesome fashion. He was such a deviant, though, this Hostius Quadra, that Augustus didn't condone the killing of the slaves, so the slaves were allowed to get away with it. So that just shows you how bad he must have been. And this is an excerpt from Seneca, who wrote about Hostius Quadra as follows. There was one Hostius Quadra whose obscenity formed a model for everything that was lewd on the stage. He was rich and avaricious, a very slave to his millions. He was eventually murdered by his own slaves, but the late Emperor Augustus considered his murder undeserving of punishment, and as good as declared that he had been justly slain. This man's lust knew no distinction of sex. Among other things, he had mirrors constructed that reflected images of abnormal size, causing, for example, a finger to exceed the size of an arm in length and thickness. He so arranged his mirrors that he could see all his accomplices' movements and could gloat over the imagined proportions of his own body. So at this inopportune moment, I'll reintroduce my face. So one reason for just showing this is that I'm under no, just to prove I'm under no illusions that obscenity is somehow a modern contemporary development. So I'm not describing the following argument or getting involved in the following discussion under the premise that it was always better in the old days. So there were deviants like Hostius Quadra. The point I would make is he was recognized as a deviant. And I'm throwing out there the issue of what do you do in a society in which deviancy no longer has any valence, because if anything goes, what can be described as truly deviant, and that seems to be the path Bonnie Blue and Lily Phillips are on. And I think at one point, forgive me if it comes up later, but Jean Baudrillard has a quote where he talks about the idea of someone in the middle of an orgy and someone whispers in the other person's ear, "What are you doing after the orgy?" Because they're slightly bored. It's all become very mechanical and boring, so they're trying to find what do you do after the orgy is the type of situation I think Bonnie Blue, Bop House and Lily Phillips encapsulate. So anyway, this is just setting the scene. There's always been, and always will be, but there always has been historically a notion of obscenity. But also, art has always been a refuge for eroticizing the obscene, for sublimating it, for changing it into something artistic. So I'll give you a series of examples now. So this is Joaquin Segoya, who's basically a Spanish impressionist. And he's certainly gone for the peachy aspect of it all. So that's all obviously plush and the feminine form, a panegyric to pink. But there's just and by the way, I'm not claiming this is fabulous art, but I'm just suggesting I don't think, even if you were a prude, you would call that obscene. I think in our complex artistic technical language that would be described as being all about the base. And similarly, an even more appropriate musical and visual reference regarding the bass. So these just two quick examples just to show you how the female form was used for erotic purposes. And then just to give you a sample of how far we've gone, how quickly we've gone. Largely, I'm going to continually bemoan because of social media. But this is a painting by John Sargent. And in and of itself, nothing particularly controversial, you wouldn't have thought. But what was interesting was, so it's only, 140-ish years ago. And what this painting actually caused a massive scandal. And the original doesn't exist anymore because this was altered. The original was altered into this. But I believe this is a photograph of the original. And the fact that the strap was hanging down in Parisian society at the time caused an absolute scandal. That's to the extent that he had to alter the painting. So on the left is a study, a sketch he was doing that shows, again, without the strap. But just to go back, that was just deemed too much. And what fascinates me is that was deemed too much because it would have been acceptable to have had, as you saw in the previous painting by Segoya, the nudity properly presented, properly in inverted commas, was totally acceptable. But that hint of something being awry This is the tension involved in eroticism. It's not nudity per se, it's the relationship between the depiction of the hint of something. So lingerie, without getting too graphic, lingerie isn't full nudity. It plays with the revealing and non-revealing at the same time. And this is just the mere hint, a strap falling off a shoulder. But it was in those that was able to produce such highly eroticized reaction from critics. And I'm trying to just clumsily make the point that you could not get that response nowadays. It's almost laughable to think that that could cause a scandal. And I'm not claiming it's better now or worse then. I'm just pointing out that cultural mores could change that much so quickly, and then ask you to think of perhaps what lies behind that. So in order to start exploring that idea, if you break down the word obscene and you think about what the prefix ob represents, so just the basic dictionary definition of the prefix ob, meaning toward, to, on, over, against, originally occurring in loanwords from Latin, but now used also with the sense of reversely or inversely. And it says here, conform new Latin English scientific terms like object, obligate, and oblanceolate, which I thought I had quite a good vocabulary, but I'd never heard of that before. Oblanceolate is leaf-shaped, apparently. So there's the word for today. Oblanceolate. But what I want you to focus on there is the notion of over and against. So the way Baudrillard, as I'm going to describe him, his approach, he looks at the notion of the obscene as this going over and against the concept of a scene. So another way of thinking about that is that we've imploded, we've lost our distance from looking at a scene. And our society, with things like social media, have created an implosion, a loss of distance. We've lost the scene. So to give a very practical, quick example, I think this is the Roman theatre at Basra in Syria. But you can see that the round semicircle is where the orchestra would be. And this is Roman, so it's not the same. The raised stage would have been in the earlier Greek version of theatre, but they wouldn't have had the porticos the same way. I think the porticos in the Roman tradition were partly because they needed somewhere to exhibit the spoils of war. But anyway, I could witter on about Greek and Roman theatre. The idea is the Romans took the Greek basic notion of theatre and developed it further. But this isn't a million miles from the Greek original. And the key thing is the audience is separated, first of all, by the horseshoe-shaped orchestra. Then there's the raised stage where the actual actors would have been. And the orchestra it may have been some musicians, but also the chorus, as in the Greek chorus. And on the stage itself would be the actual actors. So there's a distance, there's a tiered system. So you get to see something at a distance. And it sounds such an obvious, simple point, but that has been the tradition of theatre and cinema even. Since time immemorial. I get my point, cinema is just an extension to some extent of old-fashioned theatre. But that enjoyment of art has always been premised upon the concept of distance. So, in a previous talk I did about Albert Camus, more than once Camus refers to the loss of the stage set. He uses the exact phrase stage set. So when he's talking about people feeling alienated and existence being absurd. He describes how we lose a sense that we're on a stage set, we lose our familiarity with our surroundings, and existence suddenly becomes really feels absurd. So that's Camus. I think this notion of the obscene, the hindering of the scene, as in the thing I just showed you, the Greek and Roman theatres known as the proscenium stage and the proscenium arch, the separation between the audience and the stage. And Louis Sass, who I've quoted a few times before in his book Madness and Modernism, he also uses similar terms to describe how schizoid autistic experiences of the world tend to be this loss of familiarity. People feel alienated, people feel suddenly distanced, excessively distanced. So I'm going to claim throughout the rest of the talk that things like theatre, the ancient Greek theatre, found a way to control our sense of distance, to enable us to see things at a distance that was socially conditioned and ritualistically help society and communities bind themselves together. And we've lost that distance in either because there's too much distance, there's this schizoid experience of not feeling familiar, of not feeling community, or there's the implosion, the complete loss of distance, the complete loss of a scene that ends up creating things like Bop House, Lily Phillips and Bonnie Blue. So this is where we get into Baudrillard's work in his book In the Shadow of the Silent Majorities. The task of all media and information today is to produce this real, this extra real, interviews, live coverage, movies, TV, truth, etc. There is too much of it. We fall into obscenity and pornography. As in pornography, a kind of zoom takes us too near the real, which never existed and only ever came into view at a certain distance. So it's counterintuitive and paradoxical, but one of Baudrillard's basic points is what we call the real has always involved a necessary distance for us to appreciate it as real. And the minute you start messing with the necessary distance, you create feelings of unreality, whether it's the excessive reality of pornography or whether it's the schizophrenic experience of reality in a very discombobulated way. And apologies, because I can, in my paper that backs this up, all the references are there. But I'm guessing The Shadow of the Silent Majorities was written sometime in the 80s, would be my best guess, with my senile memory. So it's quite, I'm suggesting, given what's happening now, this was quite prescient to Baudrillard. I think he, for all the fact he was supposed to be an impractical postmodern relativist, I think he really described well the things that are going on. And then to try and make this, because some people, postmodern French avant-garde theory, whether it's called postmodern or whatever, isn't their cup of tea. This goes back to a slide I've used previously regarding Ian McGilchrist's work, neuroscientist, and he describes how this is in the matter with things. The frontal lobe is a percentage of the total brain. So dogs, 18% of the total brain is the frontal lobe. Monkeys, 30%. Great apes, 35%. And humans, 37%. So most of McGilchrist's work is actually emphasizing how the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain work together, and our society has become too dependent upon the left-hand side of the brain, and the right-hand side of the brain, which is more reliant upon patterns and art and literature. The left-hand side of the brain is much more abstract in the sense of science and quantification, and as most things in life, moderation is the key. McGilchrist argues we need to have a balance between the two, and we've gone too far over to left brain side issues. This idea of the anterior and the posterior axis, it's not left and right, it's front and back. This is how he describes the significance of the front. And what is the frontal cortex for? Largely for stopping things happening. To members of a society in which doing things is much more highly valued, and I should say, than desisting from doing things, this might seem paradoxical. Yet this negation is highly creative. It puts necessary distance in time and space between ourselves and the immediacy of experience. This enables us to stand back and see things in perspective. It enables us to delay gratification in order to achieve a greater end. So there's two immediate things I'd say there. One is, I hope you can see how similar in a way that is to Baudrillard's writing. So they're approaching it from completely different angles. Baudrillard is a pure theorist, cultural theorist, stroke philosopher. McGilchrist is a neuroscientist. But they both see that the human experience and perception requiring distance, and what McGilchrist brings to the party in addition is a neuroscientist's knowledge of how the anterior axis, the frontal cortex enables us to delay gratification. So given what I've been saying about Bophaus, Bonnie Blue, Lily Phillips type phenomena, to say that they lack an ability to delay gratification might be the understatement of the millennium. And in individual cases, that's one thing, but then it begs the question, to what extent as a society as a whole are we increasingly unable to delay gratification because our society and culture is geared towards non-delay? And that, I think, is what McGilchrist and Baudrillard, in the very different ways, help to describe and explain. So just to re-emphasize this, that there is necessary distance and desire. I'm going to do a whole video because I found a Finnish philosopher who I don't actually agree with, but he's got some interesting ideas about. He does a very systematic analysis of the concept of desire that he defines quite narrowly. But I'll be looking at desire, that the whole precise nature of it in a lot of detail. But in the meantime, one aspect of desire that actually I disagree with this Finnish philosopher slightly, but it's the concept of desire is a relational concept. It requires distance. So this Finnish philosopher describes how desire tracks satisfaction, as how he describes it. He argues there's no point having desires if they can't be satisfied. And he goes on to argue that if you desire things that are never likely to be satisfied, that is a recipe for anxiety and disappointment. Now, partly I agree with him, but partly, as we'll see in a second, I'm going to argue one aspect of desire is necessarily dependent upon distance and not being satisfied. Which again, in our society, the idea that something isn't satisfied is quite revolutionary. But I think there's strong arguments to say that actually some aspects of desire, not all, but some aspects of desire are predicated upon non-realization. And again, that's hardly what Bonnie Blue is about. So again, this is McGilchrist. There is a proper distance between ourselves and the world which enables us to see what is going on. It's like trying to read a book. Too close and one cannot see anything. Too far away and one cannot make out the text. And this is true of all human experiences. All require and benefit from necessary distance. Thus, if the relationship between the frontal and posterior cortex is antagonistic, yet it is in pursuit of the same goals, negation is not by any means merely negative. And again, sorry to bang on about it, but just to reiterate, the purpose of why I'm flagging this up is this concept of delayed gratification and distance and relationship. The idea that there's physically in our brains a distance between the frontal and posterior cortex. Distance is baked into our heads, just like there's left hemisphere and right hemisphere. And everything in modern social media dominated society is about the reduction and the implosion of distance, whether it's Greek and Roman ancient theatre or the parts of the brain that we value and cater to. So I started off this slide by talking about the idea that some desires aren't meant to be met. And I'll show you some quick visual examples, because I don't want to be too wordy all the time. But here are some visual examples drawing upon Dante and his unrequited love for his muse Beatrice. So this is Dante's Beatrice, and obviously he was the author of the Divine Comedy, but also is it Via Nuova, the New Life, which was an autobiographical piece he wrote. And this Beatrice, he saw her, you'll see some more paintings in a second, but he saw her first when he was 9, and she was just a few months younger than he was. And then he next saw her when he was 18, and I think she married a banker. So he only saw her twice. She then married a banker and died at the age of about 24. And then he spent the rest of his life, he did marry, but he spent the rest of his life using her as an inspiration for this ideal woman. And it's complicated by the fact there is a phenomenon known as courtly love, which was not Courtney, but courtly. I should speak more clearly. And courtly love was premised upon the idea of you love someone who's inaccessible, and you use the inaccessibility and the non-consummation of your desire, and you sublimate that into writing, daft poetry and playing the mandolin till your fingers bleed. And it was a social practice or a cultural practice of sublimation, basically turning feelings into art, which again probably sounds incredibly alien to a modern audience. So this is Rossetti's depiction of beautiful Beatrix. Here's another painting. And again, apart from the fact everyone's fully clothed, I'd draw your attention to the idea of distance that's being portrayed. And then this is one I've seen in person, because this is John William Waterhouse. Oh, sorry. Take that back. It's not John William Waterhouse at all. But I think what's got me confused is I'm pretty sure this is in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, and I've seen it, but was unable to remember who actually painted it. Apologies. And then this is a depiction of her imagined deathbed. So Dante is dreaming about seeing her on her deathbed, the old romantic that he was. And then I mentioned the Divine Comedy, but this is uh, Gustave Doré, who I inflict on you all the time. I forget the chance. I think his illustrations are absolutely brilliant. But sorry. Well, this is very early on in the Inferno. Beatrice am I, who did thee go? So he meets Beatrice in the afterlife when he goes down to purgatory. So when I looked at Camus, I think I referenced Eurydice and Orpheus going into the underworld to rescue her, and as he's leaving, he can't feel her, so he looks back and she gets dragged back into Hades. I think I said in the last video she was turned to stone, but I think I'm getting confused with Lot's wife. But she's dragged back because he turns around when he shouldn't. So Camus references it. And then I just find this interesting in Baudrillard's Simulations, he also makes this reference, but he turns it on its head slightly. For ethnology to live, in other words, for ethnology like studying people in their habitat, its object must die, but the latter revenges itself by dying for having been discovered, and defies by its death the science that wants to take hold of it. Doesn't every science live on this paradoxical slope to which it is doomed by the evanescence of its object in the very process of its apprehension, and by the pitiless reversal this dead object exerts on it? Like Orpheus, it always turns round too soon, and its object, like Eurydice, falls back into Hades. The logical evolution of a science is to distance itself ever further from its object until it dispenses with it entirely, its autonomy ever more fantastical in reaching its pure form. So there's a couple of reasons I'm interested in this. In this. One is the idea is, again, it's this concept of distance. So one of Baudrillard's key points is that science takes too much distance, unlike the classical theatre with the organic nature of the stage, the orchestra pit, and then the audience. And yes, especially in Roman times, Greek, it was much more democratic. In Roman times, the audience was more stratified and based upon class. And there were imperial symbols that weren't in the ancient Greek theatre. But all in all, it's still a community-orientated way of relating a group experience and channeling the distance in a cultural, social way. Whereas what Baudrillard's saying is science deals with quite extreme abstractions. It abstracts out of reality in order to better control it. And he just makes this classical allusion to Orpheus and Eurydice. Now, this all sounds, I can hear some of you shouting at the screen already. This may sound, again, all very postmodern, all very relativist, but I'm going to give you some specific examples. Remember, Baudrillard died in 2007. And after I've just shown you, again, because I just think it's beautiful, I'll show you the Eurydice sculpture that I showed in the Camus, the philosophy of the absurd video. So I'll show you the Eurydice sculpture by Rodin, and then I'll show you a practical example of this that was taken from a BBC website, and I think I'm right. Apologies if I've got it slightly wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was around about 2007 when Baudrillard died that these photos also, coincidentally, it's around about that time these photos are from. So first of all, the Rodin. So I just think it's beautiful the way in Rodin's sculpture he manages to embody all these abstract notions of distance. And just the materiality, the way everything comes out from the stone, just stunningly, stunningly beautiful. And may I just add, there's lots of nudity there, but it's, unless you really are a pervert, I would suggest that's not the thing that jumps out at you immediately, is the nudity. So again, it's arguably the difference in pornography and eroticism. You know, the nudity is not the main purpose of eroticism. But then, just to go back to this, for ethnology to live, its object must die, but the latter revenges itself by dying for having been discovered, and defies by its death the science that wants to take hold of it. Now, I can imagine lots of people reading that thinking, oh my God, these French postmodern theorists, you know, they don't have Witter on, what's this got to do with anything? But if I can just show you, this is a previously uncontacted tribe in Brazil. And again, like I said, I think it was the early 2000s, around about 2007. And the story would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. Apparently, anthropologists in Brazil believed there was an uncontacted tribe in this area of the forest. But the government bureaucracy said, well, until we know there's an uncontacted tribe, we won't take any steps to protect them. You have to prove to us. So the sharper amongst you will already have realised, I wonder how these photographs were taken. Well, the poor old anthropologists had to go out and prove that there was an uncontacted tribe that required protecting. But guess what? The minute you go out to prove it, they're no longer uncontacted. So these poor Native Americans are probably now worshipping the god Cessna. So these poor people, you know, never been disturbed before, in order to meet the requirements of the Brazilian bureaucrats, they're now it's a bit like Prince, isn't it? This is the tribe formerly known as the uncontacted tribe. I just think it's a brilliant practical example of what Baudrillard's talking about. For ethnology to live, in other words, for the scientific study of people to live, its subject must die. So this is a different work by Baudrillard, but I think it develops a similar point. This modern and disenchanted view is a total misunderstanding if it considers the body to be an object waiting only to be undressed. Especially since all cultures of the mask, the veil, and ornament say precisely the contrary. They say that the body is a metaphor and that the true objects of desire and pleasure are the signs and marks that tear it from its nudity, naturalness, and truth, from the integral reality of its physical being. In all places, seduction is what tears things from their truth, including their sexual truth. And if thought takes off its dress, it is not to reveal itself naked. It is not to unveil the secret of what had been hidden until then. It is to make the body appear as definitively enigmatic, definitively secret, as a pure object whose secret will never be lifted and has no need to be lifted. So this is just a completely different way. It's in complete opposition to what Baudrillard argues is the scientific method of uncovering absolutely everything. And by extension, the pornographic attitude of everything has to be made naked. What Baudrillard makes as the counterintuitive point, that true objects of desire require veiling. True objects of desire and pleasure are the signs and marks that tear it from its nudity. And he introduces this concept of seduction, which I'll explain more in a second. But seduction is the opposite of the pornographic values I started discussing with reference to Bonnie Blue and Lily Phillips. So if you think of seduction, implies an inherent aspect of vagueness. So And again, this is just how I was going to say how dated things are, but dating, to use the word again, people just don't realize that, pre-online dating, people actually had to take a risk and talk to someone at a bar who they'd never met. And I totally understand the whole pickup artistry idea, and for women who wanted to go out on their own, it must have been an absolute nightmare, etc., etc. I get all that. But still, there was an ambiguity. There was a not knowing if, or flirting, for example, which now in most Western countries is probably an imprisonable offence. It's the whole spectrum has changed. Seduction, ambiguity, enigmatic relations between the sexes is all out the window. I think there was a period where they still do it. In some American colleges, if a couple were going to get frisky, they would both sign contracts about agreeing to what level they were prepared to go, which I can see how it fulfills all health and safety requirements, but it doesn't exactly meet the spontaneity requirements, does it? But anyway, just to develop this point further. So I love this title of one of his books, The Ecstasy of Communication. So we no longer partake of the drama of alienation, but are in the ecstasy of communication. And this ecstasy is obscene. Obscene is that which illuminates the gaze, the image, and every representation. Obscenity is not confined to sexuality, because today there is a pornography of information and communication, a pornography of circuits and networks, of functions and objects in their legibility, availability, regulation, forced signification, capacity to perform, connection, polyvalence, their free expression. It is no longer the obscenity of the hidden, the repressed, the obscure, but that of the visible, all too visible, the more visible than visible. It is the obscenity of that which no longer contains a secret and is entirely soluble in information and communication. So again, wordy, 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 but it describes, I think, quite brilliantly the social situation that creates Bop House. Everything becomes part of the pornography of circuits and networks. So that just perfectly describes social media in that context. So last bit of text before I give you some more practical examples. From the discourse of labour to the discourse of sex, one finds the same ultimatum, that of production in the literal sense of the term. To produce is to materialise by force what belongs to another order, that of the secret and of seduction. Seduction is at all times and all places opposed to production. Seduction removes something from the order of the visible, while production constructs everything in full view. Everything is to be produced. Everything is to be legible. Everything is to become real, visible, accountable. This is sex as it exists in pornography. But more generally, this is the enterprise of our culture, whose natural condition is obscene, a culture of monstration, of demonstration, of productive monstrosity. And maybe I'm just a sucker for Baudrillard's mode of expression. But I would argue strongly, and I think a main argument of this whole channel is art has a seductive property that stands in opposition to the way in which science reveals everything to the nth degree. Art allows for enigma, allows for paradox. I've mentioned this in previous videos. Art deals with paradox, art processes paradox, but doesn't try and destroy it, or doesn't try and shunt it off to the side. But now, he talks about more generally, this is the enterprise of our culture. our condition, our natural condition is obscene, meaning the scene, the necessary distance has been completely removed. And all that's left is this, a culture of monstration, of demonstration, of productive monstrosity. So interestingly, here's another example. And this just goes to show you how long this type of stuff's been going on. So believe it or not, I don't mean to be lookist, but this is Catherine Millet, and her book was in 2002. As you can see, it was called The Sexual Life of Catherine Millet. And I don't mean to be dismissive or rude, but she was a self-confessed raging nymphomaniac. Looks can be deceiving. And she basically related, act by act, like a modern-day Marquis de Sade, just endless mechanical couplings in this weird, I'm assuming it was Parisian subculture of bourgeois decadence. And this is Baudrillard describing in a second. He talks specifically about Catherine Millet, but I think this is relevant as well. All this belongs to the ludic realm, in other words, the realm of play, ludens, Latin for play, where one encounters a cold seduction, the narcissistic spell of electronic and information systems, the cold attraction of the terminals and mediums that we have become, surrounded as we are by consoles, isolated and seduced by their manipulation. This is the modern meaning play, the ludic sense, connoting the suppleness and polyvalence of combinations. Understood in this sense, play, its very possibility, is at the basis of the metastability of systems. It has nothing to do with play as a dual or agonistic relation. It is the cold seduction that governs the spheres of information and communication. And it is in this cold seduction that the social and its representations are now wearing themselves thin. And one thing I'd immediately pick up on there is, so play is something I'm going to develop in a lot more depth with reference to metaphor. But all the way through so many videos, I've made a point about talking about the way in which art plays with our perceptions and our ability to conceive of things. But this notion of the dual or agonistic, this picks up on what Ian McGilchrist is talking about between the anterior and the posterior cortex. They exist, as do the left and right, in a slightly agonistic, in other words, oppositional relationship. But as McGilchrist said, this opposition, this negation between the two is not negative. It's immensely productive. The anterior cortex stops you diving in and making stupid mistakes. So it's teenagers, it's not fully developed, which is why they're so bloody stupid and take such silly risks. So this notion of cold seduction, that the enigmatic, not knowing what the outcome of an encounter is going to be, like an actual duel with swords or pistols, that's been taken away, and you have this fake ludic, pseudo-ludic, pseudo-playful combination of all these circuits and consoles. And just to give you a more humorous example, as I start to wrap up, but this Debbie does the salad. I mentioned in a different forum, I'm always intrigued by the way in which in a society, the very thing that's no longer valued becomes the thing that's superficially, purportedly represented all the time. So I always use the example of, in the Soviet Union, the Pravda, the newspaper, and in Russia has about 4 or 5 different words for truth in different contexts. But Pravda is this socially sanctioned truth, and it was full of Soviet propaganda. Likewise, in British bureaucracies, when they use the word excellence, you know that's the very moment excellence has died. So there seems to be this retrograde reliance upon calling something the very thing that you've just already killed. That's almost like a tacit admission of like unconscious guilt. And this is all a very long-winded way. It's an introduction to this Debbie Does Salad. For a while, and still, there's lots of food programs. But if you think about it, a lot of food cookery programs, I would love to know the percentage of people who watch them who've hardly ever been in a kitchen. So at the moment that in our society, relatively few people cook for themselves anymore, never have cookery programs become so popular. And because I started off using the examples of the obscenity of TikTok and the obscenity of Bonnie Blue and Lily Phillips, I just thought this was a vaguely amusing example of the Food Network in America. And it's quite a dated example, but I don't think things have changed that much. I'll see if I can get the voice right for this one. A desperate housewife stirred at sturdy young Tyler. Could his wrath con pollo quench her flaming desire? The camera zeroed in as Tyler expertly spread raw chicken breast across a cutting board. That's the quintessential pussy shot, Nitka said. The colour of it, the texture of it, the camera lingering lovingly over it. Tyler gingerly rolled the glistening lips of chicken breast into a thick phallus, which he doused with raw egg. I feel a lot of love right now, Tyler told his transfixed acolyte. This is a sexy dish. This is the pizza man, declared Nitka. There's the helpless woman who can't do it for herself. In walks the cute young guy who rescues her. So this is from a vaguely, it was quite a serious study of Food Network stuff. But he's obviously portraying the way that these food programs are presented in basically a pornographic fashion, even though it's not actually about porn, but it's food porn. So coming up to the end now, but the concept of absorption, not reflection. One of the aspects of this loss of distance is with all the things Baudrillard's talking about, the circuits, the cold seduction. What happens is we no longer reflect. We no longer have the distance to reflect. Instead, we're absorbed into these circuits. So unlike the Greek or Roman theatre, where you're reflecting upon the fact you're able to reflect because there's social distance involved, we live in a world of circuits of absorption. So he makes specific reference to the Narcissus myth, which some of you may know I'm completely obsessed by. So bending over a pool of water, Narcissus quenches his thirst. His image is no longer other. It is a surface that absorbs and seduces him, which he can approach but never pass beyond. For there is no beyond, just as there is no reflexive distance between him and his image. The mirror of water is not a surface of reflection, but of absorption. And I think that it reiterates all the themes we've been talking about, but this idea there is no reflexive distance. I do think it's a qualitatively different experience to be absorbed to the extent that you no longer reflect. So I've hardly ever, this will not shock you, but I've hardly ever played video games. But to the extent that I ever did, I remember just feeling you could waste an hour or 2 hours easily, but there'd be like an empty feeling afterwards. It wasn't that those 2 hours had changed you as a person. Whereas if you read a decent book or watch a decent film, it's not the same type of. You can be absorbed in the common linguistic use of the word absorption, but it's not as overarching. It's you retain reflexive ability that you lose in these cold circuits of seduction that Baudrillard writes about. So, in terms of distance and desire again, this is Louis Sass talking from a psychiatric point of view. Distance must here be heard in a metaphorical sense. We are speaking not of literal spatial distance or of some actual physical barrier, but of the lived or felt sense of separation, unreality, or deadening inherent in a stance or attitude of disengagement. What Louis Sass is describing here is schizophrenic patients of his, or people on the schizoid autistic spectrum who have feelings of alienation. And they routinely said to him, I feel distant from reality. They feel, so he's saying it's not an actual literal sense of distance. They're in the world, but they feel disengaged. They don't feel connected. And what I've been trying to express all the way through this talk is the way in which traditional forms of art are a very culturally naturalized. It's contradiction in terms of, I was going to say culturally naturalized, but they're they're obviously cultural, but they present our engagement with art at a socially constructed distance that has a huge tradition behind it and contains loads of condensed wisdom. And it's worked for centuries. And it's helped people feel grounded. If you're in an ancient Greek theatre with all your fellow citizens, witnessing stories and even new plays that are based upon traditional stories, the sense of community is palpable. You can feel the person sat next to you, their hairy legs poking out of their toga. But Sass's patients don't feel this. And that begs the question, to what extent is mental illness at least partially a result of the society we've created through the media we use? And what I wanted to emphasize here was, I've just mentioned classical Greek theatre again, but paraklausthiron, God, that was a mouthful, but it literally means lament beside a door. So paraklausthiron. I did used to know how to say that. Paraklausthiron. Right, I got there. Lament beside a door. And if you think of, I'm trying to think of Midsummer Night's Dream, Pyramus and Thisbe, and in the play within the play, the Mechanicals' rude play, I think it was referred to as, but they're talking through a wall, and that's a reference to an ancient play. And there was this genre whereby lovers spoke through a barrier. And that goes to what Sass is talking about. So it isn't an actual physical barrier that some schizoid people are feeling, but it feels like a barrier, but it actually isn't a literal one. And in artworks, this paraklausthiron, it's the whole point of it is to represent in an artistic form a barrier to desire. So lovers were separated by a door, by a wall. They would have to talk to each other through a barrier. So I'm just making the point that our grounding in the world and our own relationship, our physical relationship to desire, is contained within quite ancient ways of representing that desire in art forms. This what I'm calling here the sublimation of distance. And this is the final piece of text, but I go back to Ovid's Metamorphoses. The myth of Narcissus, which I'll keep coming back to and boring you with time and time and time again, but it's pretty much 2,000 years old, Ovid's Metamorphoses. And yet it's an incredibly sophisticated artistic reflection upon how we reflect upon the world around us. So this is just a little excerpt of Narcissus looking at his own reflection, but not reflecting upon his own reflection. So as Baudrillard points out, you can be absorbed, and that's not reflection. It's different. And this is what the myth of Narcissus so cleverly portrays, the way in which Narcissus doesn't reflect. He becomes entranced. He's cursed by the gods. So all he has is absorption. Not knowing what he sees, but burning for it. The same delusion mocking his eyes and teasing. Why try to catch an always fleeing image? Poor credulous youngster, what you seek is nowhere. The vision is only shadow, only reflection, lacking any substance. I just think it's brilliant and amazing that 2,000 years ago, Ovid could basically describe your average screen-obsessed teenager. The vision is only shadow, only reflection, lacking any substance. And not just a teenager playing video games, but back to the start of the talk, your average teenager with an unhealthy affection for Lily Phillips or Bonnie Blue. It just shows you how little human society has progressed, but also what an absolutely amazing insight into the human condition the classical artists like Ovid actually had. So I'll finish with the picture of Narcissus yet again, and I hope you enjoyed that. Until the next time, all the very best.